This is what they did to Italian women during World War II. Introduction. War is generally regarded as a purely male enterprise. However, it is often women who suffer the most, not only during the war but also in its aftermath. One of the cruelest evidences of this fact came right after the Battle of Monte Cassino in central Italy during the first months of 1944. The Battle of Monte Cassino was part of the Allied advance across the Italian peninsula towards Rome, which was still under Nazi occupation. It was one of the hardest fought battles of World War II, and the Allied victory came as a deadly blow to the Germans in Italy. But instead of going down in history as a heroic struggle to liberate the Italian people, it became infamous thanks to the sheer violence that was exerted upon the civilian population, and mainly its women. The brutality that these Italian girls and women had to endure during months at Monte Cassino was so extreme that it became known in history books as the Marocchinate, after the fact that many attackers were foreign soldiers from Morocco. Who were these Goumiers, the colonial soldiers from the French Expeditionary Corps who unleashed unending savagery against Italian women? What horrible fates awaited the women of Monte Cassino after dark? Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The so-called Battle of Monte Cassino was in fact 4 different military engagements that took place between January 17, 1944 and 18th May of the same year. The Allies, who were pushing from the south after disembarking in Anzio and other places in the coast, needed to break through the winter line to be able to reach and liberate Rome, the center of Nazi power in the peninsula. This objective was achieved on June 5, 1944, after the Italian capital had been held by the Nazis for 9 months. It was the day before the Allies disembarked in Normandy, effectively commencing the liberation of France. It were in fact some of the French troops operating in Italy that gave the Battle of Monte Cassino its infamous blemish known as the Marocchinate. At the beginning of 1944, the western part of the Winter Line, whose main pivot was on the steep slopes of Monte Cassino, was held by the Germans, who had positions in the valleys of the Gari, Liri, and Garigliano rivers and some nearby peaks and crags. On 14th May, the French army set out to break through a field at Monte Cassino in the Italian province of Frosinone in the Lazio region. Thanks to the devastation wrought in France by years of German occupation, its army in 1944 was composed in part of the so-called Goumiers. The term Goum referred to a company of armed North African mounted tribesmen who were employed during the French occupation of Morocco from 1908. Later on, in World War II, it became synonym with Algerian, Moroccan and Tunisian troops in the French army. The French advanced, destroying the German lines and allowing the British of the British 12th Corps to break through the resistance, giving the Allies a free hand to move on to the next defense of the Wehrmacht, Adolf Hitler's fearsome army, which by this time was suffering from an inexhaustible demoralization in its ranks, along with an undisguised retreat in its European advance. Monte Cassino was the place where the Germans resisted the most. Allied forces responded by attacking the Benedictine Abbey at Monte Cassino with 350 tons of explosives between February and May 1944. However, their attacks faltered amid a determined Nazi resistance and Allied exhaustion, as the 2nd New Zealand Corps was held in reserve, rather than committed to the tail end of the hard-pressed Allied mountain attack north of the town. The First Battle of Cassino ended with the Germans in possession of the town, the heights and the monastery looming above. This prompted the Allies to conduct airstrikes on Monte Cassino and the proper town of Cassino to defeat the Third Reich forces stationed there. The French Expeditionary Corps that allowed the Allied army to finally break through the German defenses were commanded by General Alphonse Juin, a seasoned commander who had fought on different sides throughout the years. Knowing the significant sacrifice his men had gone through to secure the Allied victory, he congratulated them and gave them freedom of action. This would prove to be a mistake, as the following hours saw some of the most heinous crimes in the entire war. Juin is said to have harangued his men beforehand, assuring them that if they won this battle for 50 hours, they would be absolute masters of whatever they could find beyond the enemy. He also assured them that no one would penalize them for what they did or ask them what they were doing. The following night, thousands of Goumiers marched up the mountain slopes, surrounding towns and villages in the region known as Chiocciaria. For the locals, the end of the battle was not a moment of joy where they recovered their freedom lost to the occupying Nazis. Instead, it was the beginning of an absolute nightmare. Witnesses would later claim that when the Germans were around, men would have to hide. But when the North African Goumiers came, it was their daughters and wives that would need hiding. The Goumiers reportedly indulged in sexual assault and looting at an unimaginable scale. It was a true rampage where even young boys and old men were sodomized by the insatiable French troops. Complaints were made to Juin about the behavior of his men. Even the Pope was called upon to intervene. Later, he would take the extraordinary step of banning Allied colored troops from entering Rome. Looting, like sexual assault, is also as old as warfare itself, and Allied veterans from all nationalities cheerfully admit to stealing food, wine, and valuables from the houses of Italian civilians. So automatic was this practice that the Germans took to booby-trapping attractive-looking propositions to catch out unwary Allied troops. Many Allied soldiers died while trying to steal from Italian civilians. Prisoners of war were also considered fair game, and few would make it to the prison camp still in possession of their watches. Other stories are darker and related only with great regret by veterans. Several have told of their revulsion when a comrade stole from a dead body, in some instances cutting off the finger of a dead German to steal his gold wedding ring. Perhaps more than anything else, this illuminates the debilitating effects that war has on the behavior and morality of those forced to fight it. Who were the Goumiers? Fearsome but ungovernable troops. Linguistically speaking, the term Goum comes from an Arabic word which means to stand up. The Goumiers, mostly Moroccans, made up the French Expeditionary Corps on the Italian front. There were also Algerians, Tunisians, and Senegalese soldiers in the corps. They were considered the French irregular troops and came from the French colonies in North Africa. The most prominent Goumiers, however, were from Morocco. They knew they were frowned upon for their savage acts and frequently behaved like animals towards their enemies, owing to their bad reputation. These corps were formally organized into 4 divisions commanded by General Alphonse Juin, a general with extensive military experience who was a friend of Charles de Gaulle, whom he had met at the Lycée Militaire. Juin was born in French Algeria and fought in both World War I and World War II on behalf of France. Juin was captured by the Nazis in May 1940. The Nazi Vichy French regime installed him as commander-in-chief of the French North African Army. However, he quickly joined the Allies soon after the Operation Torch landings in November 1942. Juin led his Foreign Corps mountain warriors from the Maghreb with great military tactical skill and success during the first battle for Cassino in late January, early February 1944, and successfully crossed the Rapido River north of the town and monastery. He criticized Fifth Army commanders for not committing 2 New Zealand corps to the assault, which might have enabled the Foreign Corps and the US 34th Division to swing south behind the German positions and into the Liri Valley, thereby outflanking the Winter Line during the first battle for Cassino. Later under his command, the 4 Foreign Corps divisions adroitly moved through a difficult, mountainous area during Operation Diadem, contributing greatly to the breakthrough of the Winter Line in mid-May 1944. For this, Juin was praised, but his name would later become forever associated to the senseless abuse of the Goumiers. The North African settlers that joined the units led by Juin numbered 7,833 in all, and they easily identifiable because they wore a characteristic green woolen tunic with multicolored bands and rope sandals. They were not exactly dressed for combat, but their uniforms would later inspire fear in the enemy and civilians alike. They also carried the so-called jambia, a weapon that evokes mystery and tradition. The jambia is a dagger with a curved blade that varies in size according to the taste of the bearer, and it is said that they used it to cut off the ears and noses of slain enemies to make necklaces. It was in the town of Cassino that the French army came up against the hard power of the Germans. Adolf Hitler's forces put up fierce resistance, not resigning themselves to losing the position. Up to this point, the Goumiers had advanced without any real difficulty across the Italian peninsula. 3 groups of Goumiers, under the name Corps de Montagne, were the vanguard of the French Expeditionary Corps attack through the Aurunco Mountains during Operation Diadem, the 4th and final Battle of Monte Cassino. The town was finally captured by the Allies on the 18th of May, 1944. Despite this impressive deed, they are not mainly remembered for having defeated the Nazi army, but for their brutal and inhumane atrocities, for the merciless treatment of their victims, innocent civilians, objects of their cruel and atrocious behavior described as typical of beasts, after General Juin gave them carte blanche when the battle ended. It seemed as they immediately took their revenge on every inhabitant of the area. Regardless of sex or age, all the local people became targets of their fiercest sexual appetites, frighteningly aggressive and sadistic. Not content with this, their material appetites made them break into houses and take everything of value to them. If anyone resisted, they met even worse fates. All this was done with the backing of the French commander, who motivated them to carry out such a bloody horror, and with the complicit silence of General de Gaulle, who definitely knew of these events. Him being the ultimate military authority, it was under his power to stop the madness, but he chose not to. The Third Reich forces that had left the Monte area east of Cassino partially undefended knew that only Moroccan mountain troops could have managed to survive in that region, and they were not wrong. Knowing what they were capable of, the Germans warned the civilian population of the impending danger with an airdrop of leaflets, inciting them to flee that same May. Despite the impending terror, not everyone was willing to heed the warning message from the skies of their own enemy occupying the country. The only ones who managed to save themselves were the many children evacuated by the fascist Republican National Guard. They were sent to colonies in the Rimini area, where they were saved. The vast majority of refugees, however, chose to hide on the Poleka Plateau, a territory at the base of Mount Petrella. But the highly trained African soldiers accustomed to the mountains managed to easily reach them and submit them to the same or worse abuse than the rest of the Monte Cassino civilians. This abuse frequently lasted all night, and the screams of the victims would be heard in the distance by other Allied troops. On the morning of 14th May, the Americans found that the Germans facing them on the high ground around the town of Santa Maria Infante had gone, having retreated in order to keep contact with their left flank, which was reeling from the French attacks. After that, they pressed forward through the mountains and had only rear guards, mines, and booby traps to face. On their right flank were the Goumiers, and the Americans were instructed to wear adhesive tape on the backs of their helmets to avoid being mistaken for Germans if they ran into the North Africans during the night. Even Allies were afraid of what the Goumiers could do to them at night. According to eyewitnesses, the nightfall worked like a spell, as it was the time when men became monsters and unleashed their rage against the civilian population. American machine gunner Len Ziabas was attached to a unit of Goumiers and recounts how when they reached the town of Spigno they could hear firing and screaming coming from the village. They knew that there were no more German troops there, so they were unsure of what was going on. A fellow American said, "I think they're attacking those women." One of the sergeants asked whether they should do something about it, but he was informed that they had to await orders. They continued to hear the screams of women through the sounds of the war, a harrowing experience. A particularly gruesome sight was witnessed by other American soldiers who recount how they found a preacher that had been horribly beaten and abused, and later his body was thrown to the streets like garbage. Upon asking other people about the fate of the priest, they were informed that he had the terrible idea of interceding and trying to save 3 little girls from being abused by Goumiers. They then turned their attention to the priest, who was badly beaten, tied to a post and sexually assaulted by several men who took turns throughout the night. Finally, the priest died as a result of his injuries. The French military command, not pardoning these crimes, straightaway executed a certain number of the guilty, but that did not stop the savagery. In military terms, the French had much to be proud of. Juin's audacious attack through the mountains had smashed the southwestern flank of the Winter Line, and the speed of the subsequent attacks prevented the Germans from holding the Hitler Line in the coastal sector. It also made the German position in the Liri Valley much more difficult. The British were aware of this, and late on 16th May, 8th Army Commander Lieutenant General Leese ordered the 78th Division to cut Route 6 behind Cassino. At the same time, the Polish Corps, which had taken such a battering on the opening day of the attack, was to try again at the dreaded monastery. Eyewitness testimony of the unbridled cruelty against women, girls, and priests. There are many witnesses and direct or indirect victims of these atrocities caused by the soldiers. Locals still recall with horror some of the scenes they saw and experienced firsthand. Although many are no longer alive to tell the tale, the story of what they experienced has been passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation and continues to this day to give veracity to one of the many dark chapters of the terrible war. The wounds inflicted by that unconscionable attack are far from healed, and those who suffered from it cannot forget a single moment of it, as their stories reflect. Many people were forced to leave their homes, as they did not feel protected there. Several people and entire families hid together to be safe, knowing that many did not have that privilege. Going outside almost certainly meant having to pay the consequences. Hiding, trying to stay safe, they used to hear constant cries for help, even though they could do nothing. Many survivors report feeling a sense of cowardice, but on the other hand, there was little they could do to help their fellow human beings. They preferred not to be the new victims, but instead to protect their loved ones. When night fell, the nightmare began. One could hear the moans of the young women who had been abducted during the afternoon. It was a wailing that found no solace and chilled the blood of those who had to listen to it. They thought in turn that they might be the next to suffer the same violence. So they kept silent even though the cries were desperate. From then on, the Battle of Monte Cassino became synonymous with horror. The word Marocchinate remained in the popular imagination of this region, which experienced the terror of war at first hand. Entire civilian populations fell victim to the Allies, who in theory had come to Italy to liberate them from Nazi occupation and to rid them of the brutal fascism of the Axis, led first by Benito Mussolini and then by Adolf Hitler. The French military army on the peninsula consisted of 130,000 men, including almost 8,000 African settlers. All were tainted by these aberrant deeds. What happened was far more terrible than the worst nightmare imaginable for those to whom it was addressed. Perhaps most terrible of all is the fact that all this happened in a single night, that of the 18th of May 1944, after the soldiers had listened to their commanding general. Thousands of Goumiers left their camps to roam the area encompassing several villages in the Chiocciaria region. Feeling free to do as they pleased without punishment, the most terrifying hell broke loose. For more than 50 hours there was no control and no resistance, and group violence took over. Everything was hellish, and the viciousness with which they treated their victims was terrifying. The troops were selective at first, picking the most attractive victims to attack first, but then they unleashed their full capacity for evil with no concern for who was on the receiving end. Among themselves, no one prevented the aggression, quite the contrary. They encouraged each other to encourage and increase their degree of cynicism and go on for more. As if it were a competition, they strived to create the most dantesque scenes, terrible in magnitude because of the damage caused, where no adjective can describe the aberrant nature of what was experienced. In many cases, it was simply children who were chosen for the abuse, not even teenagers or mature women, as would happen later. Even grandmothers, who in many cases were over 80 years old, were martyred by the Allied attacks. In one village in the region that was stormed by hundreds of Moroccan soldiers, 30 women and 2 men were reportedly attacked in a short time. Everything happened so fast that no one could warn them to hide. There was no salvation or escape for the recipients of this disaster. In another locality, 2 sisters were forced to satisfy a platoon of nearly 200 soldiers in a shocking act of unprecedented cruelty and viciousness. The suffering caused during the harassment was deliberately and unnecessarily escalating. Another truly incomprehensible case is that of around 300 combatants who went on a rampage against an older man and decided to sexually abuse him in groups as a way of entertainment. Abusing men was a routine act that satisfied their monstrous thirst, and no village in the region was safe from this. From the written records of the time belonging to the National Association of Civilian Victims of the War, it is known that a parish priest by the name of Don Alberto Terilli confronted the looters to save 2 girls, aged 6 and 9, to be attacked by a group. He simply wanted to save them from the abuse to which they would be irreparably exposed. The soldiers' reaction was swift, and the priest was brutally abused instead, in full view of the girls. In the village of Pico, a girl and her sister were crucified in a public square, while the family was forced to watch the grotesque act. Stories of this level of savagery abound, and savagery, extreme sadism and outrageous brutality were the norm. General Charles de Gaulle, commander-in-chief of the French army, knew all about what was going on in Italy with his troops under his command, but did absolutely nothing, not only to prevent it, but to bring it to justice afterwards. And General Alphonse Juin, who gave the go-ahead for these atrocities to happen, was never punished by his superiors. Over the years, a great deal of documentation and testimonies came to light, which made it possible to reconstruct the unbearable events in more detail. Elements were gathered to reconstruct this hidden truth with greater precision. Historians agree that it was General Juin's harangue that ignited the chaos and set off the worst possible scenario. The culprits were found to be soldiers who, upon hearing their superiors' words, gave way to their uncontrolled rampage regardless of the damage they were causing, an irreparable calamity of an unthinkable magnitude. The fuse was lit, and anyone who resisted, whatever their condition, would also be the object of their aggression. All the small villages in that region, without exception, were savagely attacked. No one was safe, and the inhabitants had nowhere to go. There was simply no place to escape from such human calamity. The practice carried out by many consisted of holding their prey by the ankles and wrists to immobilize them, and then taking turns in line to consummate the sexual act. An atrocious and cowardly act carried out by many. It is said that in a village in the area, 4 women no older than 15 years were forced to sexually satisfying a troop of 100 soldiers for hours. As a result of this attack, one of them died and another had a psychotic break from which she would never heal and was locked up for the rest of her life in an insane asylum. The other 2 were seriously traumatized. But in addition to these aberrant acts, the Goumiers were busy ransacking homes and stealing any valuables they could find. The stripping of houses was another of the undesirable practices suffered by the inhabitants of this region, a barbarism without limits, which, despite lasting more than 2 days, had eternal consequences. The numbers of horror. How many women were attacked? The mayor of the town of Esperia, a commune in the province of Frosinone, reported that in his town, 700 women out of a total of 2,500 inhabitants were sexually assaulted, and that some had died as a result of the attacks. In the course of the events and throughout the affected area, more than 7,000 civilians, including children, were sexually abused by members of the Goumier Corps. The number of men killed has been estimated at 800. The Marocchinate massacre is believed to have claimed almost 200,000 victims. People of all ages were attacked, abused, tortured, and murdered without any sort of accountability. According to historical documents, there were over 20,000 cases of sexual assault, but this figure only takes into account those who were brave enough to denounce the outrage they suffered. However, this does not reflect the reality in its entirety, as many cases went unreported, probably the vast majority of them. Specialists project numbers as high as 60,000, which means most of the women living in the area had to endure some of the worst abuses and tortures known to mankind. Moreover, reports revealed that many women and girls were repeatedly abused by more than one perpetrator. There are even reports of the soldiers breaking the teeth of victims during the assault to prevent them from biting them. Witnesses also talk of impalements and castrations, the targets of which were mostly men who tried to defend their daughters, wives, sisters, or mothers, as no one was safe from the brutal and terrible attacks. It is also a known fact that there were several mutilations performed by Allied soldiers for mere amusement, using their famous jambia daggers for this purpose. It must be remembered that the Goumiers were not mercenaries nor voluntary foreign fighters. They were soldiers employed by the French Allied army, and as such the high command of the French military was responsible for their actions. The ruthless and cruel nature of the sexual violence carried out by Allied troops are corroborated in recovered medical records. Also reported were infections of syphilis, gonorrhea, blenheroia, and other sexually transmitted diseases, an enduring reminder of those terrible nights after the Battle of Monte Cassino. Only the introduction of American penicillin saved these areas from an epidemic that could have wiped out the remaining population. Unwanted pregnancies as a result of the Goumier attacks numbered in the thousands, and many ended in clandestine abortions performed in improvised and unclean settings. Those who were too afraid to go through this harrowing and dangerous procedure decided to have their pregnancies come to term. After the end of the war, in September 1945, many children were born as a result of these assaults, many of which were given for adoption to the Veroli orphanage. Estimations of the number of babies that arrived at the Veroli orphanage are around 400. Of course, this was an extremely large number for the area, and most of those children were never adopted and continued living in the orphanage until they came of age, never knowing who their real mothers and fathers were. Archival documents make it clear that it was not only African soldiers in the French army that were responsible for the attacks, but white Frenchmen also participated in this outrageous violence. Contrary to what the Allied propaganda tried to have the public believe, it was not an ethnic issue. It was one of the darkest events in the midst of the most brutal military operation in the 20th century. Native French nationals accounted for about 40% of the fighting force, and it would be impossible to attribute responsibility for the grievances to the African colonists alone. Of course, when General Ewing authorized them to do as they pleased without reprisal, he was speaking to the troops as a whole, and not just to the colonists. France has historically tried to avoid taking responsibility for what happened. Whenever the issue has been raised, it was implied that the events of the Marocchinate should be attributed the misconduct of a part of its troops alone, instead of being a generalized situation in the French army. This official French position offers a very racist and discriminatory discourse, as it ignores the fact that it was General Juin himself, of European blood, who incited the troops to unleash unending violence upon the civilian population. A British record makes it clear that French soldiers with no links to Moroccan or North African roots were responsible for countless sexual attacks on women both young and old. Such assaults happened not in obscure basements, but publicly in the middle of the streets. This provided an additional humiliation to the victims and made identification of the perpetrators easier. The same British report describes the sodomization of hundreds of prisoners and the castration of those considered the leaders of their community. This demonstrates the absolute indifference and complicity of French officials who appear to have participated in the massacres and remained silent in the face of this appalling act. The same report said that absolutely all the women in the villages of Patrica, Pofi, Isoletta, Supino and Morolo were sexually assaulted. In Lanola, 50 young women, the majority of the female population in this small village, were assaulted when the French troops arrived on the 21st of May. As there were not enough women to go around, girls and old women were also picked for abuse. At the time, the International Red Cross offered its help to the Italian government, but the latter strongly opposed it in order not to strain relations with France and not to produce a major conflict at the international level. Thanks to all these actions, a cloak of silence was placed over the events of Monte Cassino by both the perpetrators and the government of the victims. Their senior commanders were ignored, there were no accusations, and there were no internal affairs within the military ranks. It simply came to nothing. In this savage context, occurring in isolated mountain villages in the midst of a global conflict, it is difficult to establish the exact number of deaths and cases of abuse. There were probably tens of thousands affected by these sexual assaults, regardless of gender and age. It follows that it is also difficult to know the number of people who, as a result of the psychological and emotional trauma caused by this outrageous experience, were unable to continue their lives normally. Many of them interrupted their studies and experienced difficulties in finding or keeping a partner or starting a family. Some even ended up taking their own lives or becoming clinically insane. Secret military reports recount these abuses, providing a harrowing record of one of the worst episodes of this tremendous war. Here we learn that even animals, the reports say, were targets of their sexual attacks. The methodology employed by the combatants is fully detailed in these documents. They recount the modus operandi of many of these aggressors. If the door of the house was locked, they would break it down and, finding a person inside, they would knock them unconscious with a blow from the butt of their gun, then drag them close to the house and abuse them in front of the rest of the family, and under the horrifying looks of any passers-by. The aftermath of the Marocchinate, 80 years of impunity. As time went by, victims were encouraged to speak out and to provide more information about this unbearable experience that left them scarred forever. This involved a great deal of courage, not only because bearing witness forced them to recall these horrific events, but also because they exposed themselves to public shame and accusation. One woman testified that she saw Allied soldiers spot a girl with expensive-looking earrings in her ears. One of them reached over and unceremoniously yanked them out of her ears with his bare hands. The witness recounted in detail the screams of pain the victim emitted in that savage scene, while the soldier just seemed amused by her pain. Another witness was surprised to see her younger sister sitting motionless with her head between her legs. As she approached, she noticed a trickle of blood running down her legs to her feet. In a clear example of the pressures on the women to keep quiet about these humiliations, when the older sister asked the mother what was wrong with her sister, the mother simply asked her not to bother her, that she had just hurt herself. It was only much later that she managed to understand what had happened to her poor sister. A group of women who initially fought back individual assailants were attacked in a pack. Their resistance was useless in the face of the large number of attackers. First, the assailants took out their guns and fired a few rounds in the air to frighten them, and then they began to separate the girls, proceeding to assault them individually in small groups. They were unable to defend themselves in any way. Those who tried to defend themselves from such an outrage suffered dire consequences, whether they were neighbors or family members. Many were pierced by a sharpened stick or stake lengthwise as a form of torture and execution, and slowly perished as a result of bleeding out. One father who tried to defend his daughter at the top of the Mount Cassino was beaten to death. There are countless chilling accounts of the cold-bloodedness of these individuals who did not seem to feel remorse for anything. One witness tells how a soldier entered her house while another waited outside. Her father came out and asked what was going on, to which the soldier outside only responded by shooting him point blank. He was killed on the spot. To this day, some historians and truth-seekers continue to push for justice to act and to bring some closure to the horrifying events of the Marocchinate. Some even demanded that the Italian government should gather all the testimonies and evidence to take action with France so that they take full responsibility for the facts and compensation. Surprisingly, many witnesses of this terrible and violent act are still alive. On 18 June 1944, Pope Pius XII urged Charles de Gaulle to take action. A year later, the French courts had indicted 300 Moroccans for what had happened on Italian soil, although the results were not what the outraged international community had hoped for. It is believed that at least 10,000 soldiers participated in one way or another of these events, and not only Moroccans but French, Algerian, and other nationalities as well. Conclusion. On the 26th of November 2004, 60 years after the fateful nights of the Marocchinate, the president of an association of Moroccan ex-combatants, Hamid Benrahalate, officially apologized for what had happened in Monte Cassino. This was a brave action that sought to bring some closure to the victims and also to expose the events of Monte Cassino to the general public, who was mostly unaware of the savagery of those nights. But it also had another important effect. The official apology made it clear to everyone around the world that the French government never took the same steps to compensate the families of the affected. To this day, no public apology or acknowledgement of what happened at Monte Cassino was issued by the French government. This is a clear statement of negligence and carelessness for the memory of the people who were affected. The horrors of war generate anguish and tension in both the combatants and the local population. However, no level of stress can justify using the female body as the object of the most basic passions. Sexual violence cannot be understood as a justified catharsis after what was experienced on the battlefront. The crimes of Monte Cassino could have been avoided, but the responsible commanders of the Allied army not only did not avoid it, they encouraged it. Many have tried in vain to find an explanation for so much pain, but nothing can justify what happened, not even the horror of war itself. It was a criminal act, a horrible and savage bout of violence by a group of soldiers who were given permission to do whatever they wanted with the guarantee of not paying the price for their ruthless acts that caused so much damage. It is even more unforgivable that, throughout history, the governments involved have never offered an apology to the victims, who have only their voice to tell their story and prevent it from happening again.